report, which I am the chair of. And so I'll give you just a brief overview of a very good discussion that we had with Michael Chase. It's good that we seem to have regular good discussions with Michael. And the thing for me and myself and Dr. Cook express to him the pleasure that we both have in the management of our account and the service that we get from him in our meetings. The thing he did tell us is that they went through another name change, and with this the merged as the merged entity, they're now Fiducian Advisors, and they hold or manage, I should say, $18.4 million of STCC funds, of which $13.4 million is in our long-term investment category. And the good thing there is, there was an overall good market in the first quarter. And from a long-term perspective, we had a 3.8% return in the quarter versus our benchmark of 2.4. So we outperformed there. And for a full year perspective, the return is 22.8% versus the benchmark of 18.7%. So very good performance. As you all know, the overall market has been up, but it's good to see our overall portfolio performing well in a long-term space. Even in a short-term space, it performed even with the benchmark at down 0.4%, but again, even with benchmark. And then as I look at just overall, since we've been working with now Fiducian, a 6.6% return in a long-term portfolio versus 6.9% for our benchmark. So overall, good story in our investment portfolio, and again, a very good discussion that we had with Michael Chase. Any questions, comments? Great. Okay. With that, we will move right into our fiscal year 2021 finance review. Dorothy Unger.
Okay, if you could just advance. There you go. So we currently have about $9 million at TD Bank, and based on an overall reduction in spring-summer enrollment of 19%, we are projecting to end the year at a balance of about $3.2 million. So if you advance the slide, a couple more. Okay, so as you can see, we're getting close to the end of the year. We only have a few more columns of the detail left. So typically, we project the following year's cash flow with the June Ways and Means meeting. So I'll be doing that next time around for you. So do we have any questions on the cash flow?
Yeah, Dorothy, I had just one question for me on the utilities line. Back, I'm not quite sure what slide number it is, but where you compare the actual versus the projected for the remainder of the year, there's zero projected for utility spend or outflows. Is that accurate?
It is. Utilities we are paying currently out of our state appropriation.
Okay.
So there are times, where we do pay it out of the trust funds here, but we've been paying it out of the state appropriation, so it's zero, and that's
okay.
accurate.
Okay, great. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It was literally blank. It wasn't even zero. It was blank. So that's why I wanted to make sure that it was.
In years past, yeah, we've sent money down to pay utilities from our trust funds, but not this time around. So fortunate.
Okay, great. Thank you. I had no other questions.
And we'll move on to Jason with revenue and spending.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you.
Can we move down to slide 12, please? Thank you. So as of the end of April, we have a projected net income for FY21 of $3.1 million. Although revenue is less than budget by about $1.9 million, excluding COVID funding. So basically what that $1.9 million is made up of is about $2.2 million from student fee revenue that is down from budget. One change that we have this month is we were notified from the state recently that there's $540,000 in additional revenues coming to us, to our appropriations, $114,000 for workforce development, which we use for workforce development salaries, and then another $424,000 for formula funding. So although it's late in the year to find out this information, we're very happy to receive those additional funds from the state. We've also had expense savings of about $5 million, and that's excluding COVID funding. So basically that's made up of about $2 million from full-time employees, which is made up of the discontinued programs as well as unfilled positions. Part-time employee savings, about $1.5 million due to lower enrollment on the adjunct side, and then limited campus operations for our standard part-time employees. And then we've had about $1.3 million in utilities and operating savings. And as we get closer to the end of the year, we're going to be able to continue to dial in on where we think we'll land for final expenses and revenue. If we can move to the next slide, please. This is pretty much where all of that summary information that I presented came from. Last month, MAC requested that we do a comparison for projections, which is on the next slide, but I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions about this slide before we move on.
Yeah, so I do have one question on this slide, and it's
Sure.
on line 30 in the expenses contingency. So there's $1.7 million of fiscal year 2021 actual spent.
Yeah.
What is that for?
So we have approximately $500,000 in contingency college expenses. A lot of that is actually made up of CARES funding. So that's where we ended up putting the CARES funding in FY21 for a lot of the institutional expenses. So when we talk about our testing for COVID, for our stick squad, all of those CARES related expenses, PPE, et cetera, those are going into that contingency account.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on this slide? Very good. Can we move to the next, please? All right. So what we did was we put our FY21 approved budget, and then we have 3 months worth of forecast projections here. So I put in a few comments of kind of what some of the changes are. For the most part, it's consistent from month to month. As we talked about, state appropriation revenue went up a little bit due to workforce and the formula funding. And then under expenses, we have, the savings for full-time and part-time employees. And then we've been dialing in on our scholarships and student tuition waivers, which we're projecting down a little bit this month compared to months past, due to enrollment being down a little bit lower, additional HERF funding that we're receiving and utilizing for scholarships. So they're pretty much the variances on this. Wondering if anyone has any questions or comments on this slide.
Another one question from me on this one. So utilities, electric is described as, it's a decrease from 575 in the last forecast or projection to 490.
Yep.
And it's described as a temporary save. I'm not quite sure what the word temporary.
Yeah, good point. And I apologize for skipping that one. So we actually have a meter out on campus that the Eversource is aware of, and it's our main meter. And we've been recognizing savings. They haven't been able to get the part in and get it installed. So they've been giving us estimated bills for the interim time period. We assumed that it was going to be fixed in May, but it's looking like it's June now. So we're going to see an additional month of savings for that. So it is real savings, but it's not savings that we'll see going into FY22. That's why we put temporary in there.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. Okay.
You're welcome. All right. And if we can move down to slide 16, please. All right, so this is our facilities spending report, and we're happy to have Deb here this week as well. So she'll be able to give us a little bit more information on facilities spending. But as of the end of April, we have about $1.2 million in our capital improvement spending. So going from FY20 into FY21, we had a roll forward of about $2 million. We plan on spending that full amount of the roll forward this year, plus an additional $300,000 to $600,000 of the FY21 allocation, which was that $3.2 million. So really, by the end of the year, we anticipate rolling forward approximately $2.6 to $2.9 million into FY22 as a roll forward.
Yeah, that seems to. I know last month we were asking the question: can we spend that much money for the remainder of the fiscal year? And it looked like now you're basically saying, well, no, we're going to carry over 2.6 to 2.9. We don't want to spend frivolously, obviously, but it just seems like now we got a tighter story around what we can actually spend. And
absolutely,
so, yep.
Yeah, and it really is a moving target from week to week, month to month, and Deb will definitely shed some light on that. If we could move to the next slide, please.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Janae.
And it's not necessarily directly attached to the numbers, but where are we on the radio station renovations?
I will let Deb touch on that when she speaks, unless you want to jump in now, Deb.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I will be going over later in the presentation. So I can give you an update now, or we can wait, whatever you prefer.
Thank you.
All right, great. So we can see our FY21 spending. Basically, this is our 5-year DCAM allocation of $12.1 million plus other DCAM funding that they've given us. So for FY21, we plan on spending that full $869,000 down. FY22, we plan on spending $5.5 million of that 5-year budget. But something that we've found out since last month's meeting was that the state is going to give us another $250,000 for small projects. They gave us $525,000 this year. And we're really happy to get that additional $250,000 for FY22 for small projects. So that should be very helpful. Any questions about this slide? All right, I guess we can move forward. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.
Okay, if we can just advance to the next one. So here is the third quarter trust fund and vendor expenditure reports, quarter ending March 31st. Just wanted to call out briefly, in prior quarters reports, we had included the CARES funds on these reports. And CARES is a grant, and that's not technically a trust fund. So we removed the CARES activity from the reporting this time around to be technically correct. You see the CARES activity on revenue and spending. So this report that you have here is purely trust funds, non-grants. So I just wanted to call that out to your attention.
Is that footnoted anywhere? No,
it is not. I can do that next time around if you prefer.
Yeah, it just makes it keeps it consistent.
Yep, I'll make sure I do that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
No, for me. They look tight.
Okay. And now we have Vice President Nathanson. Advance the slides a few.
All right, if you could just advance one more, please. Excellent, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So we've just heard from Jason and Dorothy about our FY21 financial performance and the projection for the year. And I'm going to put a little twist on it by bringing in sort of a different look at how we can use the federal COVID relief funding potentially in this year. So if we could just advance to the next slide. So I just wanted to start with a reminder of the what the different types of federal COVID relief funding options that we have here. So this is broken down by award and spending categories. So remember we had the CARES funding that was from last year. Then we had the Carissa funding from that we got in January. Then there's the American Rescue Plan, or the ARP funding, that we're expecting, but we don't have the award yet. Each of those is broken down into a student aid portion, which is spent just on, the money is given specifically to students. And then that's represented in blue on this graph. And then the orange bars are representing the institutional portion of the funding that we have. We can use that for COVID-related operating expenses or lost revenue. We have a lot more flexibility in how we can use that funding. And so for CARES, we received 1.9 million, both for each student aid and institutional. For Carissa, we received 1.9 million for student aid again, and then 6.5 million for institutional funding. And for the ARP, we're expecting 7 million, but again, we don't have that award yet. So just to sort of ground us, so you can see that in total, the student aid is about a little less than 11 million over the 3 grants, and then we're expecting it to be 15.5 million on the institutional side. So if we can advance to the next
Andrew, why are we expecting 7? What makes us believe 7 is the number?
That's what's been published by, that's coming from the formula. It's the same formula that's being used for Carissa, but the funding is bigger. So they're taking that formula and applying it to the funds that were in the bill. And, a number of entities have sort of put forth these lists of how much each school is getting. And for us, it's the 7 million times 2.
Okay. Got it.
And a couple of call outs are headcount and Pell eligibility are some of those drivers. So that's how we pegged that.
I see. Thank you.
So what I want to do today is talk about the institutional funds and just kind of remind us of our original plan for how are we going to use those. So the CARES institutional funds of 1.9 million, that essentially the plan was to spend that on incremental COVID-related expenses in FY21 in this fiscal year. So things like COVID testing, stick squad, cleaning, stipends for faculty who are developing online courses, things like that. Then when we found out we were getting the Carissa funds of 6.5 million, we said, well, we can use that in FY22. We're expecting a surplus in FY21, so we don't really need to use those to shore up our FY21 finances. We expect $1.5 million of incremental COVID-related expenses in FY22. That's what's in our budget. And then the remaining 5.1 million we would spend to balance the FY22 budget. And when we talk about the budget in a few minutes, we'll see that that is really how we balance that budget. And then the thinking was that we would have another $7 million. And because we're expecting our baseline budgets without COVID funding to be in a deficit in the foreseeable future, the thinking was, well, let's sort of stretch this funding out so that it will be available to give us more of a runway for coming up with sustainability strategies going forward. And just as a reminder that the valid uses of the institutional funds are really, in addition to the direct expenses, we can use that for salaries of employees that are impacted by COVID. We can use it for lost revenue and indirect percent of payroll. So in addition to those incremental expenses, we can use those funds against things that would otherwise be in our budget, and we can offset lost revenue, which essentially just goes right to the bottom line. And so if we can kind of go on to the next slide. So just to sum up, our original plan would be that we wouldn't recognize any Carissa revenue in FY21 because of the expected surplus. And we would use the COVID funds to balance the FY22 budget and save the rest for future needs. But now we have some new information. So between the last time we met and today, we've gotten new information about how we can really apply the funds to existing expenses and how we can sort of calculate a lost revenue number that we can bring right into income. And we're also looking at how easily it will be to justify expenses and lost revenue as being related to COVID now versus in the future. So it looks like it'll be much easier to justify COVID-related expenses and lost revenue in FY21 and FY22. But when we look out 2 years, it might be harder to claim that expenses or lost revenue would be related to COVID specifically. So it's a little risky to wait until FY23 to spend those funds. And I can kind of illustrate this on the next slide. I'm hoping that you can see this. Oh no, this one's okay. Okay, so we'll get to the numbers in a minute. So essentially, if we look at our overarching goals, our goals are to use the funding to cover all the incremental COVID-related expenses. We want to balance the FY22 budget. We want to maximize STCC control of the funding as much as possible. And we really need to buy us some time to develop sustainability strategies as we expect our expenses to go up. And if enrollment continues to go down, we're really, we want to make smart choices about how to reconcile our budgets going forward. And having this funding really allows us, gives us time to make smart decisions about that. So the new outlook, a new suggestion is to really maximize a recognition of the COVID funds this fiscal year in FY21. And that will, and just so you know, so that $3 million surplus that Jason just presented to us, could be much higher than that. And we'll talk about how that will work. So with that, additional surplus, we would put any excess revenue over expenses into reserves. We can do that because, it seems smart to do that because we have a higher confidence in our ability to justify that COVID spending in 21 and 22 compared to FY23. And, by doing this, once we have this money in reserves, if we recognize the revenue now, that money goes in the bank, it's in control of the college, and, versus being subject to evolving regulations that will not be in our control. So if we can go on to the next slide, we have some numbers, and I'll try to keep it a little simple here. I'm hoping you can see this, but essentially we're showing—
Andrea, there's a question.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, couldn't hear you.
No problem. Before you go off that to go over the specific numbers,
Sure.
When you talk about justifying, does that mean that there's a process that the institution needs to go through to support how the funds are expended to some regulatory agency who then determines whether that's appropriate or not, and there's a potential that they could ask for money back at a future date? Or what do you mean justify?
So there are guidelines around how we can use the funds, and we will likely get audited. Dorothy's just spent months with auditors looking at how we've used the CARES funds, and we've actually, passed that audit cleanly. But so yes, there are rules about how, there are certain things we can use the money for, and we do need to be able to justify that the reasons that we're claiming to use the funds are related to COVID. And so, there are a long list of, detailed rules around how we can do that. And then, guidelines around how we can calculate lost revenue and things like that. So we will need to report on how we use the funding.
So under your scenario, we would have the ability to justify the use of up to $7 million worth of additional funds next year that are justifiable, but that are not necessary in the budgeting process?
So we kind of have to separate the thinking about necessary for the budget versus how we can use the funds. So these funds have been allocated to higher ed institutions for the purpose of keeping them moving, given the negative impacts of COVID. And so so just to kind of put that out there, this is the intent. I also want to point out, in terms of these numbers, these are sort of examples of numbers. These aren't the exact numbers. And so, it could be 6 million, it could be 4 million, we'll have to see where we end up when we do the actual calculations. But yes, it's perfectly valid. And I was going to mention this later, but we actually, Jason and Dorothy and I met with our auditors just a few days ago, and we went over both the overarching strategy that we're looking at and some of the detailed calculations that we're planning to use. And the auditors, have encouraged us to move forward with this strategy. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm happy to.
So I guess and maybe it'll come up later. I guess I'm just confused as if we don't expend them because we're talking about not expending them and putting them in reserves,
Mhm.
how do we go through the justification process that we needed them if that's what we have to do? Because if we needed them, we'd be using them. If we don't really need them and they go into reserves, how then do you back? I mean, I guess I don't understand the timing of this justification process.
It's a really good question. Dr. Cook, did you want to jump in, or do you want me to?
Real briefly, and then let me see if Andrea can help me out on this. What we're actually trying to do is swap in federal dollars in place of our own institutional dollars, because we actually can't take the federal money and put it in reserves. So we actually are trying to spend as much of the federal dollars that we have in hand now. And any money that goes into reserves is actually our own. It's not the federal money.
Okay, so we're not putting this money that we're getting into reserves, where basically the justification process is to use those dollars. They're not going to get justified and then put aside. They'll get used, and we're saying that we then wouldn't use our own funds to balance the budget.
So when we talk about FY21, and it's really, so FY21 isn't really about balancing the budget. If we talk, because it's easier for me to think about 21. So essentially what we are allowed to do is calculate the difference between what we think our revenue would have been without COVID compared to what our revenue has been with COVID. And so there's a let's say that the difference is $2 million.
Mm-hmm.
This funding, the rules around this funding allow us to say, we can draw down $2 million of these funds, and we justify that. The backup for that is this calculation that shows we would have had, $2 million more revenue if not for COVID. And so we can claim that $2 million, and that we recognize that revenue, and then that goes to our bottom line. And at the end of the year, that can go into, we can then move that into reserves, because it'll be our sort of, positive net income, or, a surplus of revenue over expenses. So that's kind of how that works. It's a little tricky, but it's allowed.
So it's both a top line and an expense justification, or
Well,
is it top line?
Right. So when it comes to lost revenue, it's not really an expense. It's sort of like an opportunity cost in a way. We can also use the funds. So to contrast that with something like, we plan to use some of the funds for adjunct faculty salaries. And we justify that the reason we can use the funds for salaries of employees who are impacted by COVID. And so for example, if there's an adjunct professor who was teaching in person and then had to learn to teach online and is now teaching online, that person has been impacted, and therefore their salary can be justified as, being funded by this grant. So some of the funding will go to lost revenue, some will go to actually pay for expenses that otherwise would have been paid by the trust funds. And then we can also calculate indirect expense, which we do on other grants, and take a percentage of the salary, the payroll costs that we're using to pay for these funds, and actually take the indirects as well. And that will essentially go right to the bottom line also.
Thank you.
So it's, it's a little convoluted, a little complicated, but in the end, I think what we're trying to do is determine what's the maximum amount that is that we can legitimately draw down in 21. And the reason we want to do that is if we look at this set of numbers here, the numbers that are highlighted in yellow would be the amount of the funding that we would have to justify in FY23. And what I'm really looking to do is minimize that number, because I think it's going to be harder. It's easy in FY21 and FY22 to identify how much of the lost revenue is related to COVID, how much of the adjunct faculty expense is related to COVID. When we get to 23, it'll be kind of hard to pinpoint like what the impact of COVID will be 2 years out. So
this might be where you're going, Vicky. So when we have folks overseeing the use of these funds, I mean, the funds were provided to the institution to cover costs as a result of the impact of COVID. Totally get it. But if someone comes in and see we have this accumulating reserve balance, and it's basically because we're taking their funds and spending their funds, but we're taking the funds we didn't spend and we're pocketing those funds. Is that the intent? So would they expect us to come in and keep us whole, or would they expect to come in and see that they've actually contributed to our bottom line by, it looks like, $4.9 million over the 3-year period?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so we asked the auditors that, and they assured us that, this use of the funds is really, what the government intended. I think that different colleges will need to use it for different things. Some, we happen to have a strong bottom line this year, mainly because of the expense savings. But, this is part of the intent. So it buys us some time to, build back up to where we would have been without COVID. I can also say that, the CFO group across the state, has been talking about different uses of the funds. And there are a number of other community colleges using the same strategy. Not everyone is doing this, but there are others that are doing this.
So back to kind of Vicky's question. So you can justify, it looks like, $6 million of lost revenue, or a combination of lost revenue and expense in 2021. So
it might not be 6 million. I think that this is really to illustrate the different options. What will have to happen is, Jason has been, and I just want to give Jason credit. He's been sort of pushing this for he's been sort of bringing this up for months. And, we're just finally getting the information to be able to sort of put it forward. But, he's been doing a lot of calculations in the background to figure out, how can we make the best use of the funds. And so what'll have to happen is probably when we get close to the end of the year is when we'll finalize some of these numbers. Some of the things we'll probably do, some are easier to calculate than others, but so it will not be like an even 6 million. It'll be some number probably between 5 and 6 million. But I think what we're looking for at this point is kind of maybe a mutual understanding that we could go ahead and, at least try to maximize the FY21 revenue recognition so that we get control of those funds.
But we don't have these funds allocated, is that right? You're saying we estimate that we're going to get 7 million. It hasn't really been allocated or funded.
That's okay. That's a good question. If you go on to I don't have to go to the slide, but some of your questions are coming up on the next slide. So yeah, what happens? So let's say what happens if we take $6 million into revenue in 21, and then we don't get the ARP money somehow. I think it's very unlikely. I mean, everyone's expecting that to come through. But if it didn't come through, we would still would have put that $6 million into our reserves, and then we could then just use that to balance the 22 budget if we needed to. And so we're not really any worse off, but it does give us the control over those funds. But if we leave it sitting out there and we don't use it in 21 and 22, it'll be hard to use it in 23.
I guess maybe I'm being a little bit dense. So Mac, if I'm not getting it and you are, we estimate maybe $7 million. It hasn't been allocated nor funded. Why are we trying to put it into fiscal year 21 when we've got 30 days of the fiscal year left?
So the money that we're putting into 21 is essentially the Carissa funds that we did receive. So that's available to us to draw down right now. So we had the Carissa funds is where that original 6 million came from. Okay. It's really, we're counting on the ARP funds for 22, in general, the way this is sort of shaking out. So what we could do is say, we're not going to spend beyond what we have available in the Carissa funds, and then we could save the ARP funds to balance the 22 budget. That could be an easier way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how we would even begin to say that we were going to use the ARP funds that haven't been finalized or allocated or funded. So the Carissa funds, if that's the dollar amount that's been designated and we know it and it's available to draw down, that makes sense. So are we saying we haven't drawn any of those funds or used any of those funds today?
We've used very little because we were planning to use the Carissa funds to balance the 22 budget, but now the thinking is to bring, to bring it all forward. So bring Carissa into 21 and then save the ARP funds for 22.
The auditor said we can do that.
Yes.
What I seem to be hearing is that the risk of not proceeding this way is that we may not have that opportunity in 2023. Is that correct?
Right. And so if you actually go to the next slide for a minute, we can come back to this one, but I brought out a couple of risks here. So, what happens if the ARP funds don't come through for 22? And really, we think that's unlikely, but then we could access the reserves. We expect to put funds into reserves in 21. And then if for some reason the ARP funds didn't come through for 22, we would still have them, have money in the bank to be able to, reconcile the 22, reconcile FY22. The other question is really, if we come out in 21 with, let's say, an $8 million surplus, what happens in terms of, at the state level? Does the state of Massachusetts say, well, now we're going to reduce your appropriations? And that's unknown, but we do think that, we know that other community colleges are using the same strategy. The folks at the Mass Association of Community Colleges are pushing this approach. We have, support from them as well, and the auditors are supporting it. So, we're looking at these risks, but I think there's less risk to putting money in the bank now than there is to leaving the money out there and then having trouble drawing down the funds later. So it's really,
that piece makes sense to me. I guess the piece that I go back to finding very hard to justify is that, anybody who looked back at our financial reporting would show that we in May were anticipating an excess of revenue over expenses of $2 million. Without drawing down all of these funds, which we are now going to say we really needed to have survived in fiscal year 21, but we didn't draw them until the last month. And then we went from a positive number of 2 million to potentially 8 million. It just seems like we are, and not that others aren't going to do it and that it doesn't get done, but it's pretty clear that we're just playing the game of drawing down the funds at the last minute to not lose them. And to me, I'm not really sure if we needed them, why we weren't using them throughout the year. Because it seems hard to believe that with all the extra expenses and the loss of revenue in terms of lower enrollment, how we got to being at $2 million over without having drawn down these funds. And maybe some of it is we didn't do some of the CapEx spending. I guess the numbers aren't really making sense to me, but it's certain you're talking to the accountants and others, but it just seems like anybody who looked at our numbers would say you just clearly drew down the funds during a particular period before year end and set them aside.
So that's actually that's a really good point. It really is. And I think that's why our original thinking was, well, why would we draw down the funds now if we're expecting a surplus? And, when we talked about that with the auditors the other day, and they said, the purpose of the funding was not just for this year. The purpose of the funding is really to strengthen the higher ed institutions so that they can weather the impact of COVID, not just this year, but into the future. And so, the problem is that the timing of the funding and the justification of funding isn't sort of fitting when we actually need it. And so so for instance, the lost revenue we did lose revenue. The only reason that we have a surplus is because because the activity on campus was so much less than what we had expected, but the revenue was substantially lower as well. And so, at least the auditors are telling us that it's perfectly legitimate to recognize this revenue in lieu of the lost revenue. So, but I totally get what you're thinking. It took me a while to come around to this as well. So,
I can help.
I understand.
I can help. I can help with a bit of context too. Again, this is the grappling, right, that we're doing as an institution. And here's just how hard this year has been. The reason we didn't spend CARES Act sooner is because it really came out with very stringent strings attached to it. It wasn't until the federal election and then in January that opened up, which is why we didn't spend CARES sooner and apply that. Carissa, right, also didn't happen until what, January, February. So that was a very new relative wrinkle to all of this. So that's really been a lot of the moving targets, is what the federal sort of outlook on how we use these and how much that has changed from, frankly, May of last year till now this year. The other thing too, Andrea said very early on something really important, which is that our base budget is a deficit. I think we have our work cut out to sort of help make sure that that is clear to everybody. Our base budget is a deficit budget. Multiple millions this year that those federal dollars help prop us up. It's 5 million is the base deficit budget next year, which helps prop us up. And frankly, probably at least 5 million the year after. So as much as auditors or anyone will come and see these monies going into reserves, depending on what the federal government outlook going forward is, we may come back to you in future years as trustees and ask you to help us bring them back out again to balance out what is a base deficit budget.
Okay.
And there's no concern about showing a $9 million reserve after 2021 and then an expectation that we're going to get $7 million more. I mean, if I was looking at that, I'd say, well, we clearly don't need to fund, especially now that we're coming out of COVID, right? Knock on wood, coming out of COVID, and the impacts of, in 2023 may be minimal. So why would we now send you $7 million to cover something that could be minimal in 23?
Yeah, I mean, this is when you have to pull the legislators in, Mac, right, to talk about intent. What we would show them, right, is deferred maintenance and projects and just what carrying costs for 370 employees are. That's 25 million just right there. Yep. And that's always going up. So I think those two drivers are the things that put us in deficit every year going forward now. And so we're going to need every one of these dollars.
Yep. Got it. Yeah, a lot of time spent on this, clearly. So I guess my last question here is this change in strategy the result of something that you all were thinking, or was this change brought to you by other institutions or auditors, and that's why we're going down this proposal road now?
I think, we were thinking of doing this. I mean, it's new thinking for us, although not for Jason, because he's been helping me understand this over the last few months. But it did not come to us from the auditors. Although what I can share is that the CFO group, the statewide CFO group meets a couple times a month, and we've been talking about this over several months, and there are a variety of strategies. And so it's not like someone else said they're doing this specifically, but we started to think, well, it's as we started to get more information and we started to look at how could we possibly use these funds at different points in time, and we started to think about how could we use them 2 years from now. How could we use the same justifications 2 years from now that we could use next year? And we were thinking like that'll be too difficult. And so we tried to think about how can we bring the funds forward. And then after that, we've gotten some support from both our CFO colleagues, at other schools, and the auditors. So that was kind of the order of things.
Let me help, Mac. I mean, Andrea and her team really get credit for this thinking. You and I like an active portfolio manager. I mean, this is Andrea and her team seeing the forest for the trees and helping bring this forward. I want to give her team full credit for seeing this idea of, if we can save some of our own money and spend the federal dollars that we have here, it gives us different solutions down the road. And so again, really full credit to our budget and finance team.
Understood. So we could be the only institution doing this, even though the auditors say they don't see an issue with it. We could literally be the only institution taking this approach.
That seems unlikely. I know of at least 2 other colleges that are doing this. I don't know what the magnitude of their surpluses are, but yeah, I've spoken with a couple other people, and in the group, and the auditors have told us that there are other colleges doing this as well. So they've had the conversation they had with us last week, they had with other colleges. But not every college is using the funds this way. Yes.
Andrea, do the auditors recognize the magnitude of the dollars, not just the philosophical conversation? Do they understand that we're talking about going from a surplus of 2 million to 8 million by bringing these funds in a 30-day period?
Essentially, yes. We showed them the same numbers that we're showing you.
Okay.
And we showed them more detail in terms of how we would actually, we're giving you sort of the high level of what it would be. We actually went into more detail with them. But I get what you're saying. We would, but you have a good point about bringing down all the dollars at once. And I think that what we would like to do is actually start to bring in some of these dollars as soon as possible so that we're not waiting until the end of the year. So for instance, we already know what our lost revenue calculation is for, let's say, we should start pulling in money for the fall. So instead of pulling in the money for the whole year of 21, so when we talk about, the lost revenue calculation and the salary expense in particular, we'd like to pull in those dollars for last fall as soon as possible so that when we pull in the rest at the end of the year, we're not pulling in everything at once. But again, the regulations, the clarity around the regulations really has only come out in the last few weeks. And we were waiting to get clarity. And we really weren't able to do anything sooner than that.
So in that calculation, how much of those dollars equate to lost revenue based on a declining enrollment for the fall semester?
Let's see. I probably have that here. Jason might have that handy. I don't want to put you on the spot, Jason, but let's say if we took 5 million, it's probably 2 million in lost revenue, 2 million, but it actually could be more. We could probably be between 2 and 3 million in lost revenue. It's about 2 million, I think, in salaries, and then there are additions in other categories. So that would be not for the fall, but for the year.
So it cost us $2 million to train our faculty to go remote?
No, it's really for the entire salary. So if there's a faculty member who went from being in person to remote, their entire salary for the year, we can take that and charge it to the grant.
But they all went from being in person to remote. So
and that's why the number's so high. Yes.
And how is that a COVID impact? We didn't pay them more to go remote, right?
Well, the way the regulation,
if they had training or IT or hardware associated with that, but if we were going to pay them $10,000 to teach in the classroom and we're paying them $10,000 to teach from home, how is that a COVID impact?
Right. So you know what? As a taxpayer, we could. I mean, I guess
they use the word impact. They don't mean it to mean if it's budget neutral, right? So because there was a change, that quote unquote counts. It doesn't matter if it's budget neutral. It allows us to then claim it. It's like, this is why you have CPAs who help do taxes almost too. What's claimable and what's not.
Yeah, I think one of the important points here is that the way the legislation is written, it is not written so that there's a dollar for dollar spend. It's written in a way that allows the institutions to pull in funds that don't have a corresponding outflow of dollars, like incremental outflow of dollars. It's just the way it's written. I mean, it's really, I mean, one of the things that's sort of funny to me is, you go to these CFO meetings and you have CFOs lamenting, how are we going to spend this money? It's really, an unusual situation. And so, we're at this point where even if we would not have written the bill this way, the question is, since we have this money available, how do we, claim it legitimately and leverage it for the benefit of the college? Yeah, that's kind of where we are.
There seems to be a lot of concern about claiming it. I don't quite understand that, right? So I mean, it sounds like, it's there's a calculation. It's been awarded. It's going to be $7 million based upon the factors, that Dr. Cook mentioned earlier. So why are we so afraid about losing it?
Well, because we need to be able to explain what we used it for within the within sort of the guidelines of the of the award. And so it's easy to do that now, but it will be harder to do it in 23 because it'll be harder to sort of explain how lost revenue is related to COVID 2 years out, or it'll, so it's easier to those calculations, we'll be more successful with those calculations and that justification now than we will 2 years from now.
So I guess two questions. Mac, as chair of Ways and Means, do you have any concerns that you want to have any kind of follow-up conversation with anybody about how this all looks, given that we're talking about a pretty substantial impact in what we have been talking about and budgeting and working towards, and we're at the end of May and all of a sudden we're going to, triple our bottom line potentially by the end of the fiscal year? Do you feel like you need to have a conversation or any kind of presentation from the auditors or anybody on that?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Vicki, because I know Andrea and I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, and I know she said she was going to meet with some of the other colleges where she referred to here. But the more I hear about this, again, it just seems like there's a lot of squishiness, I guess I put it, with this. And I would like to hear more from the auditors about this approach and what others are doing. And, to the point of even in 2021, we've got a surplus of $3.1 million of net income on our P&L. And when you add these reserves to it, it's like, well, who's going to approve giving us $7 million in 2023 if we're putting the additional funds in reserves when I would think we want to come in, if they're giving us funds to remain steady state, like COVID didn't happen. This isn't steady state. This is, at the end of the day, putting in our pocket $4.9 million. So yes, I would like to speak with auditors or whomever you think is appropriate to get more comfortable with this approach. You have a second question, Vicki?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that it's all above board. I think it's the timing of it and the fact that we've been all year long talking about the same reasons that you're going to use to draw these funds forward are the same things we've been talking about all year, which have netted us a position of a $3 million surplus. And now we're going to use those same things, same reasoning to now bring in.
So one clarification, one question. So we haven't been able to work from these guidelines all year. Again, this is fairly recent, right?
I could interject. March 19th of 2021 is when this clarification came out from the DOE.
Our budget needs to get balanced.
And so we've only had about a month and a half to kind of make heads or tails of this clarification. So, that's where we've been playing out these scenarios.
Vicki, I think you were frozen for a minute there. We couldn't hear you.
Sorry. So I guess I'm just saying, I think it's not that it's not justifiable, but it just seems like the timing of our justification and drawdown, given where we've been for the first 10 plus months of the fiscal year and how we've been talking about the budget and lost revenue and how we're making up for it. And now we want to draw the Carissa funds forward when it was our intention to use those going into next year so that we can then maximize the next pot we think we're going to get. I just think has a potential for either creating us to get less or to not be able to justify the 7 million, or for the state to come back and reduce the appropriation. And, if we can, and that would be great. It just seems to me like to say we're going to justify this move forward of funding in a 30+ day period when all of our budgeting and reporting has not relied on any of it just seems a little bit off to me.
Yeah, I mean, like Jason was saying, we just didn't have the information to be able to do this, and none of the colleges, were really able to do this until we've gotten the guidance that came out, a little over a month ago. So, I definitely understand what you're saying. I think that there is some risk there was actually some additional guidance that came out just a few days ago that talked about, don't draw down all the money right at the end of the year all at once. And so I think that if we do want to move forward with this strategy, it will be important to start drawing down the funds, very soon. Because it will be, so we're at the, near the beginning of May, we'd probably want to draw them down, between now and the end of the year. I think if we wait until the end of June before we start drawing down these funds, that would be more problematic. I will also say that the basis for the ARP funding, they're not looking at our financials. That will not have any impact on whether or not we get that funding or how much funding we get. There's a formula. It's based on head count, et cetera. And so, there could be, if there's any sort of risk, it's not related to what we show on our financials in 21.
So why do we talk about the 7 then is almost as if we could lose it. You're saying we can justify it now, but we can't justify it. Well, it's difficult for us to justify it later, but you're saying it's they're not looking at our financials, it's formulaic. So why are we concerned about not getting it?
We're concerned about not being able to use it. So, it would be made available to us, but we wouldn't be able to actually bring it into, recognize the revenue or spend that money unless we can justify it. And if we wait until FY23, we might not be able to justify spending that much money because we won't be able to identify it as related to COVID. Whereas right now we can definitely within the guidelines account for COVID-related expenses and COVID-related lost revenue in 21 and 22, but it'll be very hard to do that in 23.
So that makes sense to me that if we get allocated the $7 million on some formula, that we should try to maximize offsetting as much of the expenses in fiscal year 2022 budget, and maybe we try to hold some towards 2023. I guess my concern is the move forward of the Carissa funding into a very short window. And again, I'm not suggesting that we don't have the justification for it, but if I was an external person looking at this, and I don't know, I mean, are the other colleges in a surplus position or are they in a deficit position? So is somebody pulling forward funding, but they were going to show $1 million deficit and now they're going to show a stable budget or a positive budget? I mean, all of those things I think are potentially very different from our situation. So it might make sense for another institution who was showing a deficit to draw these down quicker because they can offset that deficit or whatever. But and I'm sure it's fine. It seems to me like I'd be a little bit concerned about drawing down these funds into such a short period of time. And I know you're talking about starting now versus at the end of June, but we're still literally talking about almost a 5 or 6 week period that we clearly don't have that level of expense to offset. So we're going to go backwards to say we really needed this money in the fall semester, but we didn't draw it because we didn't really know how to allocate it because the regulations weren't clear.
Can I add something as well? So the regulations that came out in mid-March specifically say that we have to be consistent with the way we calculate lost revenue from year to year. And there's multiple examples that they give us of how we could take it. We could take an average of 3 years, an average of 5 years, and then compare that to what we have for estimated revenue this year. But they also mentioned that we have to be consistent with how we claim it. And one of the specific examples is if you are calculating it twice a year, then you have to wait until on or after the last day of the fall semester. And then at the end, at year end as well, right? So if we were to choose to claim it just once a year, you know, just on full enrollment revenues, they say we can claim that for the full year on June 30th or after. So in one of their specific examples for lost revenue, they're specifically saying one of your options is to calculate and claim all of your last revenue on June 30th.
Okay. So then that seems like that's, if that's the case, then we could support it. But so I think that, again, that then is very different from saying, let's pull down some money next week or the week after for the fall semester, so that we're not pulling it all down at the same time. I mean, we need a methodology around it. And if a methodology is calculating the lost revenue based on the prior 3-year average or whatever it is you're going to do, that has a particular dollar amount, and you should be able then to justify bringing that in at that point. I don't know on the expense side how that calculation would work and how you would justify it, but I go back to, it's great that others are talking about doing this and planning on doing it, but just because they are similar in being in higher education and potentially community colleges, I also think that there's something to be said about their particular financial position, which may or may not be similar to ours. It may be very different. This would be probably a much easier conversation if we were in a deficit budget, to say we need to pull this down so that we end the year positively or stable or not as negative. The conversation probably wouldn't be happening, but we aren't. We're ending the year, and we've been talking about for many months now ending the year in a surplus. And now we're talking about trying to figure out how to draw down these funds in advance of the year end, because we don't know then how we're going to justify using the next pot that may come to fruition next year. I don't know. I mean, Mac, I think we need to kind of end this and determine whether or not what your comfort level is, and if you want to have further discussion or input with the third party on how this all gets brought in.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the auditors to get their sense, you know, for this, because I mean, it obviously this just came up, as you mentioned, kind of mid, but it just seems, I mean, if the fact that it's even listed here in the materials as a recommended strategy. So you're asking us who deal with this for what, 45 minutes on a call here for the first time to make a decision on something you guys spend daily, days, hours talking about, right? So I would like to talk to the auditors to kind of get their purview on this. So why don't we move forward, you know, with that, and given it's already 6 o'clock, we want to be respectful of folks' time.
Mac, just a logistics question on that.
Yep.
Would you like us to? We certainly can wait a month and have them at the next Ways and Means, but given the time, do you want us to call a special meeting?
Yes, special meeting, yes.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Great.
Let's try to be as efficient as possible on the next, just want to be respectful of folks' time. It's already after 6.
Yes. All right. So hopefully the budget part will be fairly simple then, because there aren't a lot of changes from the last couple. So if we can move forward in the slides, please, to the next one. So just to kind of summarize where we've been, you know, this is today we're presenting the third draft of the budget. In each of the 3 drafts, the deficit, the baseline budget had a deficit of around $5 million. So a little plus, a little minus. At this point, the budget with the COVID relief funds, and again, this is not with this is, you know, using the funds to balance the budget. We're at a balanced budget at this point. Between last month and this month, we have improved the budget by $477,000. Some of that was sort of a recalculation, reassessment of our direct COVID related expenses for next year. Last month we had it at 1.9 million. Now it's at 1.5 million. We also went back to, you know, all the VPs went to, you know, looked at their operating budgets and, you know, trimmed expenses in addition to that. So if we can move to the next slide, this is mentioned being hard to read. This is the detailed budget with the ins and outs of the Carissa funding. If we go to the next slide, this is a little simpler. The grayed out column is our budget. So at the bottom line, we can see that that is there's a net, it's net break even. One thing I just want to point out is, one of the big differences between last year's budget and this year's budget is the revenue from tuition and student fees is about $3.7 million down from last year's budget and about $1.5 million down from the projection for this year. And so, those are two big changes in the budget. I'll just also point out that to the right, the three columns to the right there, that shows the where the state funds, trust funds, and the COVID funding. And that's something that we haven't seen in these reports to date, but we need them for if we're going to vote on this budget. So if we go forward, I'm just going to go fast here. So if you want to, jump in if you have any questions, just pointing out some of the important things here. So state appropriation, essentially flat, not including that formula funding that we just heard about today. And the biggest risk item in this budget is enrollment. And, we've been showing this at 7.6% down from this year. Right now, enrollment for fall is significantly behind this number. And so, this is the number that I'm worried about. I'll talk about it in another couple minutes again, but just wanted to point that out. At this point, we're recommending a freeze of student fees. That has a $450,000 or so impact on the budget. We already talked about the foundation revenue last time, and in this case, just we're using that 5.1 million to offset of the COVID funding to offset expenses. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just get in. Oh,
Andrea,
yes.
I hate to interrupt, but is this
Sure.
the Carissa funding that's in this budget?
The Carissa funding, yes.
That
So
we're
not
gonna
the ARC
bring
funding.
forward,
Sorry?
that we're
Yes.
proposing to bring forward.
Yes.
So it can't be used in this budget if we bring it forward into fiscal year 21, right?
Well, so what would happen is either, we expect to get the ARP funding, which would then replace the Carissa funding in this budget. And if for some reason we didn't get that, which I'm quite sure we will, then at least that Carissa funding would be, would have contributed to our surplus that then would go into reserves, and then we would have the reserves to balance the budget. So either way, this is securing those funds, if we secure those funds, we still have it available.
That's the trick,
So-
Vicki. It's going into reserves. So it's taking it, literally putting it into reserves and using, it's almost like it's converting federal money into STCC money and applying those funds in the budget. That's what the trick is.
All right. So here, most of these numbers are similar to what we've been presenting in the past. We found some savings in part-time staffing. Again, pointing out that full-time staffing is just under 26,371 FTEs, and a very substantial proportion of our total expenses. One change in this version of the budget is the AFSCME contract. There's an open AFSCME contract, and we didn't realize that we didn't have. If they go retro on pay increases, we didn't have that in the budget, so that added $107,000 of expense. Just another change in this version was reducing our operational expenses by $157,000 by just everyone going back and finding some opportunities to trim. So if we move on to the next slide, we looked at this last month. It's really just showing sort of the revenue, different types of revenue stacked up against the expenses. And here we can see that, if you, with our normal sources of revenue, we would be short by 5.1 million that we're relying on COVID funds to bridge that gap. So if we go to the next slide, again, what are the biggest risks here? Enrollment really is the biggest risk. For every 1% decline in enrollment, so it results in about a decrease in revenue of about 170,000. So when the IR folks were presenting the enrollment data last month, their worst case scenario was to be down 16%. In this budget, we were optimistic at about 7.5%. So if we ended up with the worst case, that would be a difference of about 1.4 million. At this point, I mean, it's very early, but the 7.6% is very, very optimistic, and I'm sure that we're going to be revisiting these numbers, in the fall. Another variable is on-campus activity. If we have substantially more on-campus activity next year, it could increase expenses. And then there are always there's always a risk of unplanned events. So, but in terms of what are our strategies in FY22 to address unexpected deficits. So again, we talked about this reallocation of the federal funding. We could need to, potentially take a closer look at expense savings if we get to fall and it turns out that the enrollment is down and we need to, find more savings opportunities, and then potentially access reserves from the 21 surplus. Because even without moving the COVID funds, we expect to put 3 million or so into reserves this year. So, but I do think that, there are so many variables, everything's a moving target, enrollment in particular is a concern. And so, I do think that we'll be looking at a potentially revisiting this budget in the fall when we have better information. So
A forecast update. That's all. A forecast update.
Right.
A budget to be locked. We'll just reforecast based upon what we're seeing. Understood.
Mm-hmm. So that's essentially where we are in terms of the budget. So presenting you with this balanced budget, and the next part of the agenda, I think, are the motions to move forward.
Yeah, so balanced budget contingent on discussion with the auditors or whomever, so we can get comfortable with the use of the funds and this approach.
So this budget is actually with the old approach.
The original approach.
The change in the approach isn't really impacting 22 as much as it's impacting 21.
Yeah, I want to hear the words. That's okay. We can move forward.
Okay.
So we need a motion, so we just, Andrew just went through the $450,000 expected impact for keeping the fees flat. And so we have a motion with that. Would someone please read the motion?
Yes, I will. I move that the Springfield Technical Community College Committee on Ways and Means recommends that the Board of Trustees freeze college fees for fiscal year 2022 at the same level as fiscal year 2021 in recognition of the economic hardship faced by our students due to the pandemic.
Do I have a second?
Second.
If we take a roll for all in favor?
Yes. Mary Kate Murin, Max Starks,
Yes.
Vicky Krause,
Yes.
Maurice Lindsay,
Yes.
Jeff Sattler, and Janae McDonald.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nene, for reading that. We have a second motion on the fiscal year 2022 budget. Not sure if folks feel comfortable enough to have a vote on the budget at this point in time, given we're going to have a follow-up with some detail, even though I know you said it's not going to impact 22 much. And we can go ahead and read the motion if folks feel comfortable, but I'm thinking we need to defer this to a separate meeting.
Do we need to read it and then not vote on it, or can we defer it to another meeting or to the full board meeting? I mean, to me, without some clarity around the conversation with the auditors, I do think it has an impact on the 22 budget, because we're moving up what we were relying on the 22 budget to be balanced with into fiscal 21. And I know that if it's in surplus, we can then allocate it out from the surplus into these dollars, but the budget's presented with the use of $5.1 million of Carissa funds, basically, which we are now saying are not going to be available because we're going to move them into 2021.
Right.
I can help try to navigate the committee, Max. So if there's an appetite to table it, one thing we could do is hold a special meeting of Ways and Means next Monday night, assuming the auditors are available. And we could also include the potential for a revised budget. I say all that because, as you know, we need your enabling as of July 1 for the new fiscal year.
Right.
The challenge is if we wait till Ways and Means, then the last trustee meeting is like 3 days before the end of the fiscal year. So we're really cutting it close.
Yep. Okay, thanks for that context. Yeah, I'm in favor of a special meeting. So let's table this. I don't want to go through reading the motion for now. Let's just table this until, but let's connect, tomorrow on the logistics around with the special meeting and who will be there and what we'll go through. Okay. Anything else to go over at this meeting? And it's already, again, 6:20. Again, I really want to be respectful of time. I know we got facilities projects to go through. I don't believe that's going to be a quick review, though, is it?
It's not, and again, we can table that. We wanted to be sure that the trustees, the committee in particular, had a chance to come back and talk to Deb or sound her out about projects. What I can also share is we have no news, we have no joy on funding for Building 20 in particular. That's still outstanding. We very much are hopeful and, dare I say, still cautiously optimistic that sometime between now and the end of the fiscal year, we'll hear about that precious 25 million towards Building 20. But we certainly can give more room to, I think, a really important conversation is always about facilities.
Okay, good. Okay, so we'll table that. Sorry, Deborah, I thank you for joining, but we'll table that. So with that, our next meeting is our next scheduled meeting is June 14th. But again, we're going to have a ad hoc meeting in between now and then to go through the 2022 budget and the parameters around what we discussed here with this proposed strategy for funding. And with that, I call to take the roll to adjourn the meeting. Danae?
Yes. Mary Kate Murin, Max Starks,
Yes.
Vicki Krause,
Yes.
Maurice Lindsay,
Yes.
Jeff Sattler, and Janae McDonald.
Yes.
Great. Thank you all very much for spirited discussion, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night. Thanks.
All right.